it's really great having everyone here, and we're really looking forward to what comes out of the morning. This is kind of wide open, and it'll hopefully create some ideas about taking forward a project of adapting core. And so you can see we've mocked up an ebook that could be what it looks like. So obviously I've just pasted in the image from the Massafumalele Lake Michel comparison with the economy in African perspective. And that's going to be part of our discussion. So what's the sort of geographic scope of what an adaptation might look like? And we're going to talk about objectives, and Sam is going to talk about what's been happening in the South Asian adaptation. That's sort of the first one off the block. That's been where a team has been working for a few years, developing the South Asian adaptation in conjunction with teaching the English version, or what we could call the international version. And then we'll talk about trying to get to grips with the content that would form the substance of an adaptation, and we're going to divide that into two parts, which are going to be related to universal themes and to the particular. So Sam's going to elucidate what we mean by that, and that I think that will put a very useful discipline on how we think about the different elements that could come together in an adaptation. We're going to address the question of decentralization and coherence. So the idea is of creating an adaptation of the core. So it's not a question of embarking on some completely new project, which would be incredibly daunting, but rather taking the structure that we've worked on with an international team, and then thinking about how to decentralize that and how to ensure that the contributions that people want to make, the topics that people think are really crucial, to see how they fit together with the modeling strategy that's inherent in the core approach, and with the overarching themes that we've established there.
I realized last night that I engaged in a local a regional adaptation of a curriculum some years ago. It was 1960. I had just taken a job. I was a teacher in the provincial secondary school in Maiduguri, Nigeria. And I had just arrived there. I was actually terrified. I'd never taught before. I was 21 years old. And I was assigned to teach courses in history as well as math. And the history course in the Maiduguri PSS, Provincial Secondary School, was a history of the United Kingdom. I was, of course, doubly terrified because I knew nothing about that particular subject. And so I did a very bold thing. I got in my little VW and I drove all the way to Kaduna, which is the capital of the northern region of Nigeria, over bad roads, a very long way. And I managed to get an appointment with the permanent secretary and with the Minister of Education of the northern region. And I said, look, Nigeria had just become independent. I said, this is really a scandal. We're teaching history of UK to these kids in Borno province in Nigeria. And the minister said, go for it. I didn't then admit to him that I knew only a little bit more about the history of Africa than I did about the history of UK. But at least it was something that my students were interested in. And so we actually put together a curriculum, which was a history of Africa. I brought some books with me just because it was something I was interested in. And so we had two courses, history of Africa, history of Nigeria. And it was a huge success, by the way. I mean, of course, the students were interested in it. And I learned some interesting history along the way, which, by the way, I was able, when I went back to the United States, when I arrived back, just in time, in Boston, the schools were being boycotted by African American families because of the racist nature of the school committee. And so I was part of the boycott, and we set up what are called freedom schools in churches all over the city of Boston. And of course, the question is, what are we going to teach in the freedom schools? We had no idea. But one thing we thought we could do is African history. So I recycled the stuff which I had done at the Maiduguri TSS back to Boston to the freedom schools, and I quickly trained a whole bunch of people to engage in that. So it's a very exciting process to discuss with you what we might do and in the way of developing a core which really is appropriate, which is the best possible economics for our students here. I was in Bangalore a couple of weeks ago. Wendy was to have been there, but she had just broken her leg, so we couldn't work on the project together. We have a wonderful group in Bangalore. It's extremely like this. We had a meeting which reminded me very much. Tremendous amount of excitement and talent. People engaged in, well, how will we teach this? How will we introduce it? They've been teaching core at Azim Premji University for 3 years now. And there's a lot of excitement, both in higher ed and even in the secondary schools. Here's a group at Azim Premji. This is actually the first group which studied core. And they've been developing a lot of visual materials. For example, instead of the ideas of looking at the Industrial Revolution and the textile mills, this is contemporary textile. This is actually a rug production in India. They're putting together a lot of resources. At the workshop, they explained what they were hoping to do. The column you see there is their description of what the basic core idea is, and then they here were some of the ideas that they had. They're not very far along. This will make it seem like they're farther along than you, but they're really not. I mean, they're just putting ideas down on paper. What are we attempting to do? They're very committed to the basic structure remaining the same for the reason that Wendy said. It's a huge project to change a lot of stuff, and so they want to make sure that the topics are relevant to the students and the context is provided. Some of the narratives are going to be changed. As you know, at the beginning of each unit, we have what we call a hook, a narrative, which is designed to draw people in, and also to suggest, well, what is economics about? One of the things we might think about here is, imagine that, I don't know if you remember any of the hooks, but the hooks are decidedly kind of OECD country hooks. Not all of them, actually a couple of them come from India, but we could think of what would be African or South African hooks, narratives which will bring people in. An interesting project is to think of what would they be. By the way, it's not easy to write one of those narratives. It takes a lot of time and sort of good luck in finding sources and so on. They want to make sure that Indian data, by the way, when they say Indian, it's unclear whether this is a South Asian version, or Indian, because there's a group in Lahore, Pakistan, that has started to work with the group in India, a very nice collaboration across that very difficult boundary. But they want to get Indian data or South Asian data involved right away. The question of which issues are important in India, I mean, it's very interesting. For example, issues like affirmative action about the scheduled caste and tribal groups and so on. It's a big question there. Whereas perhaps in South Africa, issues of minimum wage or something else would be more relevant. They notice in this item, they're thinking of different normative perspectives. How might a South Asian, Indian, or other student in the region think differently from a moral or ethical perspective? What kinds of moral reasoning would they bring to the problem? And how can that be part of it? I'll show you an example of that in a couple of slides. There's a whole lot of topics that they think are not given adequate attention because of the, well, what shall I call it, the OECD focus of the economy. And here is listed some of them, the informal economy, dualism, and so on. I won't go through those now because that's what we're going to be brainstorming about. This is an example. In Unit 3, we take up, in the economy, we take up the question of the use of time. And that's how we teach constrained optimization. They have an idea of substituting the question of women's labor force participation, why women participate in paid labor and how much they do, and what are the cultural, institutional, and other aspects of that. And they have been collecting data and obviously a lot of narratives. This is Amit Bey Soleil, who's one of the team there. The team is led by Arjun Jayadev, but Amit is one of his key people there. That's Amit. They intend to use a lot of data. That's obviously something we can do. I think all teachers involve data from the day, whatever it is, from the news. They're trying to find a way to make this as simple as it is the stuff which we have already in the economy, that is all formatted the same way, easily manipulated, and so on. So that's what they're planning to do. Some of that would change from year to year, and therefore wouldn't be an appropriate part of an adaptation, which we see as a much more durable kind of thing. This is just a question of inserting in the text a bunch of questions which are of particular relevance to Indian students. We have there in the text the question of what we measure when we measure GDP, and a wonderful passage from Robert Kennedy about the mismeasurement of output, the mismeasurement of well-being. They're going to juxtapose that with some passages from Mahatma Gandhi about what a well-ordered society means and the nature of social relationships as being the foundations of what would make up a good life, which is what we should be measuring. There's other things they have about world cultures and the movement around the world of different cultural traits. They're thinking of boxes or something separate from the text, maybe with a different font, signed perhaps by the Indian team. One of the things they're very interested in, which they think we give insufficient attention to, is the structural transformation or lack of transformation of the Indian economy over time. And by that, they mean something quite simple, that is the shift out of agriculture into non-agricultural activities. They're collecting data. This is not presented very well. In fact, you can hardly see this, but this is the fraction of the population engaged in non-agricultural activities. And what you can see is the share of non-agricultural activities is increasing in all cases, but India is decidedly lower than the others, and of course, only very, very recently changing to increase. And so that just gives us an example of how one group, very much like the group in this room, is going about producing this as some kind of adaptation. But now let's look at the underlying principles that might inform a project like this. We start with the fact that if you're teaching an intro course, you're pulling in all the time things from the press and contemporary data and so on. I think that probably isn't what we want to have in an adaptation. That's what we do every year, and it's updated. In an adaptation, we want things which will be durable over some long period of time. I mean, that adaptation will be, of course, it'll be digital, so it can be changed from time to time, but it won't be changed yearly, for sure. And it might endure for a very long time, even decades. I mean, it's odd to say that, but remember, Mankey has been around for a very long time, and we expect this to be around for a very long time, too. So what we're trying to get at is that we're trying to get at content which really expresses the best economics we have. It's not necessarily the most current. It's not even necessarily the most motivating or engaging. That's not the primary purpose. The primary purpose is to, what is a good economics if you're situated here? And there's what are the issues that we have to be able to discuss? What are the tools we have to be able to mobilize? It's useful to think of universal ideas that are of general use and particular ones. Now, of course, that particular and universal it's a continuum. But so I'll, just for purposes of clarity, I'll act as if we can talk about these two poles. Both universal and particular things have to be in the curriculum, and you'll notice that if you look at the particular stuff that's in the curriculum now, it tends to be Eurocentric. And that's because the vast majority, maybe 2/3 of the people involved in writing it were from those countries, and also that's primarily where it's been adopted so far. But mostly what we're focused on is what I would consider to be universal content. Now, if you think about universal ideas, well, there's some things like preferences, constraints, beliefs, Nash equilibrium, game theory more generally, aggregate demand, the role of innovation and growth, the Phillips curve. These are things that probably are going to be present and important in any economy. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of the concepts which were pioneered by economists are now used right across the disciplines and even for non-human animals. Like, for example, game theory is widely used in biology now. So a lot of these concepts really are of extremely broad applicability, and they're there in the curriculum. I think we've done a pretty good job of introducing them, and that's obviously what we should continue doing. However, the content of these universals could be radically different. Preferences will be different. I mean, obviously, we know food preferences are different around the world, but also moral perspectives will be different. It's also true, although perhaps not as different as we think. A little footnote from behavioral economics. One of the things I find remarkable is how in the cross-cultural studies of behavior in games like ultimatum game, public goods game, and so on, you find remarkable similarities across the world in how people behave in those games. But of course, there are also differences. Differences in beliefs, how we translate the actions of other people into our beliefs about the kind of person they are, and so on. And these are all essential to the intelligent use of game theoretic concepts. Or think about constraints. It's interesting. We think about a constraint. Well, what's a constraint? It's a budget line, right? And then we have ice cream and something else here, and we have an indifference curve. That's what a constraint is. Well, the students in India, if they go ahead with what they're doing, by studying labor force participation of women as the first constraint optimization problem they'll be dealing with, obviously there's a different set of constraints. Some of them are quite similar, but some of them have to do with customs or let's say impositions by dominant males that may be the thing which is really a major constraint in the kinds of activities that people can engage in. Those would be much less likely to be prominent in some other societies. Obviously, the way the constraints operate will be different. Institutions are obviously what's behind a lot of the constraints. You know, what's the institution behind the budget constraint? Private property. You have to pay for the stuff you get. Well, in a lot of societies, you get a lot of stuff independently of what you pay for, either through families or through state transfers and so on. So these all are things which will be modified by the particular local content. But in addition to the local or distinct particular content which will be given to the universals, there are then also lots of topics that are maybe not given as much emphasis in the economy as we've written it, as would be appropriate to, for example, South Africa, South Asia. You know, the role of agriculture is huge in India, and it has to be included in any South Asian study, or Pakistan, or Bangladesh. Open economy macro, extraordinarily important. Resource-based economies. There's a Latin American adaptation underway, which a lot of the impetus for that comes from Chile, where of course copper is the dominant export in the economy. They want to have much more on resource-based and resource exporting economies, labor surplus economies, and so on. So after, in the last session before lunch, the brainstorm or penultimate session, we're going to be thinking about what are the topics, what are the tools that we'd like to see added. And what we did in a broad discussion, we said, okay, here are some topics we might have brainstorming breakouts about. The one thing we could easily do before we do that is, are these the right breakouts? Are there some other topics which we'd like to be discussing? I won't raise that now, but kind of maybe we can, before we actually break out, let's see if these are the right breakouts, because, we just made them up.
So let's begin by just refreshing people's memories. If you actually looked at the section on how the economy was produced, because I think it's a good input into conceiving of an adaptation, because we would think of it having some of the same characteristics. So the way that the economy was produced was that we got together a group of about 15. The number increased to about close to 20 people involved. Okay, so how did we do it? We got together this group of people. Who were these people? Well, they were academics from around the world, researchers who were particularly passionate about an area of economics that they worked on, and that were also had shared a vision of a different way of teaching economics based on the way that modern research in economics is conducted. So it was pulling together a pool. The people were, if you like, a mixture of self-selected people who were interested in doing it, and we went and filled some gaps where we very evidently needed more expertise. So that group consists of people from many countries. So there are people from the UK, the US, France, Spain, from Chile, India, Turkey, there are Colombia, yeah. And I think that's probably spans the set of countries. So really a quite diverse set. We had economic historians. So, for example, Kevin O'Rourke, who's an Irishman trained in the US, working in the UK, one of the great economic historians with interests especially in the evolution of the international economy, but with really deep networks in economic historical research and researchers. So we found through him that if you dig into the two units that he was very heavily involved in, which were Unit 2, which is the Technology Industrial Revolution unit, and Unit 20, which is Globalization. Is that 18? You see, the numbers changed over time, and it's incredibly hard for me to remember what they are anymore. But yeah, so Unit 18, which is the Globalization unit. There's a lot of economic history in that unit, and that reflects the interaction with him. So when you're thinking of who the contributors are going to be to produce an African adaptation, it's kind of tapping your networks, thinking of who's doing the most interesting research, who we can bring on board. And you'll see that there's really deep connection throughout the economy, from beginning to end, with the best of contemporary research. And this is something that the students, but also the TAs who are working on the project, really appreciate, because at the push of a button, you can get directed to what really is the best piece of work at the moment on, for example, on the debates about the origins of the Industrial Revolution. So all the stuff is there, and it's only there because of involving a core team, right? If you like, a central group, but then that group is very networked. It's networked in terms of research, and it's networked in terms of data. And that's the other thing that's a really deep resource. We've spent a huge amount of effort trying to find the best, I think there's about 300 data sets that are in the economy, finding, identifying, really interrogating the experts about whether this is the best data. So think of that first hockey stick chart. That's a live subject. People are doing research on comparative living standards in Japan, India, China in the 10th century, for example. So we're getting hold of those, that research and making sure that we're reporting the best data there is. So there's going to be an update of the hockey sticks because of that very live research environment that exists. So that's I think a really key element in making the process work. It's also what gives us the set of economists in action and the set of boxes that we have on great economists. So economists in action, we really need to get more of them. The ones I showed you yesterday were highlighting I think I showed 3 of the women economists in action that we have. We have more women than that, but the set of economists in action are still dominated by white men, and we need to get a richer variety. And we have a kind of method of producing those short videos, and that's something that should be kind of up on the agenda here, trying to think who are the really charismatic people who are doing really interesting research that we can bring into the minds and experience of beginning students to really get a sense of how exciting it is doing economics. The great economists, that's something where you tap your history of thought network, people who work in that field, who do they think should be represented? So that's how the economy was produced. I think there's one additional layer to explain, which is if you've kind of dug into the material, you'll have appreciated perhaps you didn't even notice, which would be an even greater sign of success, which is that the text reads with one voice, even though it's the product of many authors. So there's roughly 20 authors, but then there's contributions from 200 or so other people. So there's a fairly deep editorial process involved where we get that voice coming through, and we also have an extremely extensive process of fact-checking. So we've used interns, and that's something that you might want to think about as well. Undergraduates have got very heavily involved in this. They absolutely love finding facts that are not true, and they end up, there's several thousand facts now that have all been checked and are documented in an Excel spreadsheet. So that we can now, we're always encouraging people to question what they read, and we can respond often by pointing them towards the sources that the fact checkers have uncovered. So that's how the economy was produced, and I'm very happy to answer any questions about that. The platform, I think we mentioned yesterday that the interactive ebook platform is a product of the leading edge technology coming out of Cape Town, and we would hope that we can produce an adaptation that sits in the same format and is available through the offline apps and EPUBs and so on, just in exactly the same way as if you go on the website you can see the French translation. So that's the sort of aspiration, that there would be a really fantastic looking, designed, really appealing interactive ebook. The way that the authors are recognized in the economy is that for each unit there's a list of authors who are involved, so that authors get that kind of recognition, and these have already been recognized in promotion cases and through people's CVs. and have been, certainly in the British context, are now part of the way that in the threefold process of promotion, which has to involve research, teaching, and citizenship, if you like, broadly defined, then the contribution to chapters, to units in core is part of that. When we think of a regional adaptation, as Sam indicated, with the examples of South Asia, then with separate elements being contributed, we'd expect those to be set off in a different font and with either team or individual attribution. If you look at our doing economics, which is the green one with the swirly cover with the empirical projects, then you'll see that that is authored by two people, Eileen Tipo and Ralph Becker. They did, it's a product of their work. If you look at the ESPP book, the other new one, that's the core team. So some things are team authored and some things are individually authored, and everyone is recognised in one way or another. So that's how we've gone about it. Yep, I think I've already covered this. High priority to not changing the existing text. It's easy to cut stuff out because we don't want the economy to be this kind of ever expanding tome. So cutting things out is easy. Altering the existing text involves a lot of difficulties when you have teams of authors involved. So I think the way an adaptation works is by thinking about what can be removed and what can be added. And that will provide the swiftest pathway to production of an ebook. And we'd also expect this to happen, as we've done with everything else, to produce a beta version, get that out, get that being tested, really get people to say what they don't like about it, and improve it very fast turnaround process, and then publish a 1.0 version.